Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I shall try to be very quick because I know you are both cold and hungry, and so I think I shall do a very rapid overview, a visit of some industrial architecture in France, where I work. My idea being to try and underline the characteristics of French industrial architecture that distinguish it from the industrial architecture of other countries, of Great Britain in particular, and of other industrialized countries. And what I would like to demonstrate first of all, if I may, is that in France, our attention to industrial buildings goes back a long way. We are concerned not only with the heritage of the Industrial Revolution, but with far older buildings, such as this site, which is near Arles at Fontvieille, and which dates from the 2nd century AD. And this is a restitution in the Museum of Archaeology at Arles, and which shows a milling complex, which has been described as the greatest concentration of mechanical energy in the ancient world. Some 16 water wheels which could mill up to 4.5 tons of flour per day. And the remains of this site are perfectly visible in the ground today. Another old site in France dates from the 12th century and is this Cistercian abbey with the forge building. The water wheel and the forge hammer are obviously modern restitutions to show what it was like. But once again, our intention and the way we survey industrial buildings in France englobes a far wider chronological period than what we have seen so far. And this is true too of one of the characteristics of French industrial architecture, which is the remarkable importance and survival of what we call royal manufactories, privileged industrial sites, very often associated with Louis XIV's minister Colbert, and who would build these remarkable, prestigious industrial establishments, obviously, as here, to do with the defense of the realm. This is the Rochefort Royal Naval Dockyards with its extraordinary 374-meter long rope works, much restored today. It was destroyed during the last war. And also this dry dockyard dating from the 1670s. But these royal manufactories were also involved in cloth manufacture, in woolen cloth manufacture. This is at Villeneuve near Montpellier. And here, the weavers' housing, they had their looms on the ground floor. And here was a village, or a factory village of about 300 people working together. And what I'm suggesting is that these luxury places of luxury production survive particularly well in France. Another one is at Abbeville, where the buildings here date from the early 18th century. It was called the Manufacture des Rames. Rame is the French word for tenters, which were laid out in the fields behind the buildings, but the buildings are still there. And this was a site which employed up to 1,000 people under one entrepreneur during the 18th century. What is important here, this is often what historians of industry have called proto-industrial organization. There is no mechanized power. There are no steam engines. There may be horse gins, but these are places which run with human energy. And once again, glassworks, crystal glassworks, dating here back to the 16th century, and still in operation today. The Hermes group still exploits this crystal glassworks, and this particular piece, if you can see it here, is, have you seen the film by Banksy called Exit Via the Gift Shop? Well, here you exit via the gift shop, and this particular vase is on sale for 37,000 euros. But another site I'm particularly keen on, as you may know, is this Royal Tobacco Manufactory, which is at Morlaix in Finistère, and where these, once again, royal, prestigious buildings, designed by a well-known architect. Here we have architects François Blondel. The engraving is very attractive with little details of tobacco smokers, but the building still survives today. You can see here, this was the original management, here the factory buildings with 19th and 20th century additions. And so this is an important part of French industrial architecture, these royal manufactories, which are particularly well kept. Another feature is the survival in France of a large number of early blast furnaces, either charcoal-fired blast furnaces or coal-fired blast furnaces. And this one is at Buffon, not far from Dijon, obviously associated with the celebrated naturalist Leclerc de Buffon. The upper part of the blast furnace itself is not visible. Wait a minute, if we can just come back a moment. But the casting floor is perfectly visible with its rather spectacular and theatrical organizations where Buffon would invite his friends and visitors and guests to watch this extraordinary sight of molten iron coming out of the blast furnace. And here we have an 18th century ironworks, then a copperworks, which has maintained its original forge hammer. And so France, once again, because these blast furnace sites are isolated in the countryside, close to their water resources, close to their forestry resources for the fuel, very many of them are still in existence. This is one early 19th century at La Voulte, which features in some of the early treatises on iron manufacture, treatise of 1833, and one of these blast furnaces is now part of a public park, but others are still ruins waiting to be examined and restored. A brief word too about some of the utopian sites in France, or what may be considered as utopian. You probably know the celebrated salt works designed by Ledoux, Claude Nicolas Ledoux, at Arc-et-Senans, a very famous site, World Heritage since 1981. And during the revolutionary period when Ledoux was either imprisoned or unemployed, he spent a lot of time imagining how his salt works could be expanded into becoming what he called a cité idéale, an ideal city, involving both the workspace and the living space, and prisons and brothels, and everything apparently required by an ideal city. More interesting from this point of view is the utopian works, the Familistère, designed by Jean-Baptiste Gaudin. Gaudin was a manufacturer of cast iron stoves, and you can see here the factory building, and next to it what he called a Familistère, very clearly inspired by the ideas of the early pre-Marxist socialist Fourier. This was Fourier's Phalanstère, designed here with the Tour d'Ordre, and these are the buildings of the Gaudin Familistère, which are still in existence, with what Gaudin described as the equivalence of wealth, or the equivalence of riches. That is to say that there was housing, there was decent housing, and there were also libraries, and there were educational facilities. And this was a utopian settlement, which the factory itself still functions today, and which is still occupied at a remarkable site. On the other hand, when we come to 19th century industrial architecture, it seems to me that France follows basically what is a British lead in the design of workplaces, multi-story mills, such as we have seen from Scotland or from Manchester, and of course these single-story weaving sheds originally, with their sawtooth roofs, north-lit roofing, that the French call sheds, as we have seen for Switzerland. An architectural form that, as you know, is specific to industrial production, which is probably why it has become a synonym, an icon for industry, industrial site, or indeed, in May 1968 in France, for the working class. And so France has many standard industrial buildings, often designed by engineers rather than by architects, the functional tradition that has been described to us by Axel. For example, in Roubaix, which is a major textile town in the north of France, sometimes described as the Bradford of England, with its smoking chimneys, it was the city of 1,000 chimneys, these multi-story mill buildings, fully in the functional tradition that we have seen, and all these sawtooth shed rooftops. Nonetheless, within this tradition, one or two buildings stand out, and I'd like to show you one here that, as well as being inspired by British industrial architecture, in some cases, the industrialists went to the British industrial architects themselves, and William Fairbairn is well known as a designer of fireproof industrial buildings with cast iron columns. These are iron frame buildings, fireproof ones, and this is one of his buildings at Le Petit Quevilly, which is near Rouen, and which has recently been rehabilitated. Or, once again, another fireproof building, a celebrated one in the north of France, where the owner, the Motte-Bossu family, has added this extraordinary kind of crenellation to the top of the stair tower and to the top of the chimney. It's not quite clear what the owner has to say. Does he mean hands off my factory, or does he mean, you know, I'm the new lord of the manor? Something like that. But here we are very clearly within this British tradition of the fireproof multi-story mill building. I want to show you now a few exceptions to this tradition with what we might call advertising buildings, advertisement buildings, very much in the foodstuffs or alcohol fields, sectors, where the buildings might be visited by salesmen or by the general public, and where there is an attention to the architecture, which might be called what the French called une architecture réclame, what I have called then advertisement factories, and one of the best known is, of course, this Noisiel iron-framed building of 1871, or an extension to this factory, which is one of the earliest reinforced concrete buildings in France. And this, of course, was a celebrated chocolate factory, which has recently been restored and rehabilitated and has become offices for Nestlé France. Another one of these advertisement buildings is a champagne factory, which is at Épernay, with this remarkable tower, a very exotic tower. Obviously, the idea that ornament is a crime is far removed from the architect here. The architect is apparently Marius Toudroir, who is well known as the architect of one of the main railway stations in Paris, the Gare de Lyon. Or another example, well known too, is the Lou biscuit factory with its spectacular tower from 1900. But all these exceptional examples, and of course the fact that they have this extravagant ornamentation and this corporate advertising ambition, means that they are factories which are relatively easy to keep and where you don't have to have experts of industrial architecture to appreciate their appeal. These factories are one of the features then which perhaps distinguish French industrial architecture from other kinds. Within the 19th century, there is still too a continuation of this tradition of state manufactories, either within the realm of arms manufacture, and here we have the Saint-Étienne arms manufactory, remarkable ensemble dating from the Second Empire, that is the years 1850 to 1860. Remarkable too, this is one of the earliest factories I've come across with underground shafting, for the machines, very, very precocious, and which today is rehabilitated and restored as the Cité du Design. Another interesting 19th century arms factory, which is about to celebrate its 200th anniversary, is at Châtellerault. This, interestingly enough, was originally a hydraulically powered factory, and now is an archive centre and a music centre and a museum. And once again, within this tradition of state manufactories for state fiscal monopolies, another tobacco factory. This is the one in Strasbourg, co-designed here by an architect and an engineer trained at the École Polytechnique, a building which, as you can see, has survived more or less intact in its 19th century parts, and which has recently been protected as a historic monument and is being restored to accommodate university facilities. And so this tradition of state manufactories continues in France throughout the 19th century. The tobacco factory at Strasbourg was indeed a model for a whole series of these prestigious state manufactories which combine impressive architecture, which seems to express the power and authority of the state, with functional considerations such as lighting, such as the protection of the buildings from the spread of fire, and so on. It's important to point out, too, that in France, unlike the British model, the importance of hydraulic energy continued throughout the 19th century, and indeed up to the 1880s, hydraulic water-powered site was the most important form of mechanical energy used in France. This is some way removed from the British model of steam-powered industry. And indeed, when industrial archaeology came to be studied in France during the 1970s and 1980s, theories were evolved about the French route to industrialization as distinct from the British route. And this is very much concerned with these small-scale, farm-like factories, so to speak. This is one at Nantes-sous-Sainte-Anne, where they manufactured edge tools, that is to say scythes or sickles. Only a small factory with vernacular buildings and perhaps 25 workers who were also peasants, but providing the French market with their cutting tools. And there are plenty of examples of this kind of factory. This is another one, Pont-Salomon, also making scythes, where today there are demonstrations of the forge hammers by this former worker who, as you can imagine, is totally deaf. When you've heard one of those forge hammers, it's like a machine gun at close range. And so plenty of these. This is another site like that, transformed today a brush manufacturer. It was originally a flour mill, but has been transformed into a workshop for making brushes, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, domestic brushes, and still visitable today as a museum. Or this one near Rouen, which is in an early 20th century building adapted in the late 19th century to make cables and ropes. Once again, a water-powered factory. So this place of water power in France is yet another feature which distinguishes industrial architecture in France. To conclude, I want to underline the importance too in France of the use of concrete, reinforced concrete, in industrial architecture. Amongst the new materials that Axel spoke about, concrete in France during the early 19th century was very important. You perhaps know the name François Hennebique, who was an entrepreneur who took out patents on reinforced concrete from about 1890. And so one of the earliest uses of this reinforced concrete was here, for example. This is on the roof of this remarkable building, a reservoir, a water reservoir made possible with Hennebique reinforced concrete for this factory called La Grande Vapeur. It was in fact an electric-powered factory in which there were individual cells let out to people who were making combs for your hair, combs which were made out of celluloid, very inflammable material and which required a sprinkler system. And as you can see, the structure of the staircase at the angle, very similar to the place that we are in at the moment, but this is 1904. So this is a precocious reinforced concrete. The next one I want to show you, all the buildings I've shown you so far are still in existence. Here there is just one exception, which is a very well-known garage in Paris, designed by Perret in 1906 and demolished in 1970 approximately. But just to show you that reinforced concrete by Perret was also used, for example, in this clock factory at Besançon. This is also a point that has been made, is that the architects of the modern movement in France, Le Corbusier, Mallet-Stevens, none of them were adverse to a commission to build a factory. And as we shall see in reuse projects, the same is true today. So reinforced concrete and pre-stressed concrete, I'm sorry we're getting a bit ahead, is also important in French industrial architecture. This is a radiator factory to the north of Paris here, and this is a railway warehouse near Paris at Austerlitz, the Gare d'Austerlitz, designed by Eugène Freycinet, who was the inventor of pre-stressed concrete. And this particular site today is the introduction to my last chapter, which is about the adaptive reuse of industrial buildings. And I just wondered whether it was possible to speak of a French school of industrial reuse, or the reuse and conversion of industrial buildings. Probably not. So much, each case is individual, each case is specific. It depends on the nature and the location of the factory. It depends on the architect, and it depends, above all, what is the architectural brief, what are you going to put in these old industrial buildings. This is by the architect Jean-Michel Villemotte, and the building we saw a moment ago here, this building, has now become a center for startups, for young firms. And the principle here is one that is frequently used of boxes inside the box. And just to illustrate the fact, too, that Jean-Michel Villemotte is an architect not specially known as an expert in industrial architecture, but who is perfectly willing to do this kind of reconversion project. In France, the best-known architects are probably Philippe Robert and Bernard Reichen, who since the early 1980s have been transforming mill buildings such as this one in Lille into social housing, or other examples such as this different approach. This is another building in Roubaix, which you may know, called La Condition Publique. It was a textile conditioning plant which has been transformed into a cultural center. The whole question of the reconversion of industrial buildings is an important one in France as elsewhere. We cannot keep all industrial buildings by transforming them into museums, and so the new uses and the respect for the existing structure when the new uses are inserted is very important, and is an important part of reflection in France about the industrial heritage and industrial architecture. A few mentions here of recent publications about that. There is a website here, and with that, I thank you very much for your attention.